What if I told you that sometimes the most terrifying stories aren't fiction, but pieces of history that were deliberately buried? Today, I'm sharing with you one of the most chilling tales from post-Civil War Louisiana. A story so intense that it will make you question everything you thought you knew about justice and survival. If you're ready to dive into this dark chapter of American history, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Hit that share button to spread this incredible story, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I love connecting with viewers from around the world. Now let me take you back to 1867, to the humid bayous of Louisiana, where Spanish moss hung like funeral shrouds and secrets festered in the shadows of grand plantation houses. My name is Elijah Carver, and I am the boy they call the most feared who ever lived. But fear, I've learned, is just another word for respect earned through blood and survival. The morning I escaped Beaumont Plantation, the air tasted like copper and rain. I had been planning this moment for 3 years, ever since Master Charles Beaumont decided that a 12-year-old boy needed to learn what happened to slaves who dared to look him in the eye. The scars on my back still burn when the weather changes, a permanent reminder of that lesson. I remember pressing myself against the rotting wood of the slave quarters, listening to the sounds of the plantation waking up, the overseer's boots on gravel, the clang of the breakfast bell, the whispered prayers of my people asking God for just one more day of survival. But I was done praying to a God who seemed deaf to our suffering. The Beaumont family had owned my mother, my grandmother, and her mother before that. 4 generations of my blood had watered their cotton fields with sweat and tears, but the war had ended 2 years ago, and President Lincoln had signed papers that were supposed to make us free. Supposed to. The Beaumonts, however, had their own interpretation of freedom. "You ain't going nowhere, boy," Master Charles had told me just last week, his breath reeking of whiskey and tobacco. "Papers don't mean nothing out here. This is still my land and you're still my property." That's when I knew that freedom wasn't something that would be given to me. It was something I would have to take. I had been watching the patrol patterns for months. Every Tuesday and Friday, the overseer rode to town for supplies, leaving only the house servants and field hands. The dogs were kept in kennels near the main house, too far to catch my scent if I moved through the swamp. And I knew those swamps better than any white man ever would. My grandmother had taught me which plants would heal, which waters were safe to drink, and which paths would swallow a man whole if he didn't know the way. The moment came at dawn. I slipped from the quarters like smoke, carrying nothing but the clothes on my back and a small knife I had stolen from the kitchen months ago. Behind me I could hear little Sarah crying. She was only 6 and I was the closest thing to a big brother she had. Leaving her was the hardest thing I'd ever done, but I promised myself I would come back for her, for all of them. The swamp embraced me like a long-lost friend. Cypress trees rose from the dark water like ancient guardians, their roots creating a maze that only someone born to this land could navigate. I moved carefully, stepping on fallen logs and avoiding the soft mud that would leave tracks. Every sound made my heart race. The splash of an alligator, the cry of a bird, the rustle of something moving through the underbrush. By midday, I heard the dogs. Their baying echoed across the water, growing closer with each passing minute. Master Charles had discovered my absence and unleashed his hunting pack, but I had prepared for this too. I had rubbed myself with wild onions and mint, masking my scent. And I knew a place where the water ran deep and fast, a place where even the best tracking dogs would lose the trail. I dove into the current and let it carry me downstream, my lungs burning as I held my breath underwater. When I finally surfaced, gasping and shivering, the sound of the dogs had faded to nothing. I was alone in the vast Louisiana wilderness, a 15-year-old boy with nothing but rage and determination keeping me alive. That first night, I made camp on a small island deep in the swamp. As I sat by a tiny fire, eating raw fish I had caught with my bare hands, I thought about the stories my grandmother used to tell, stories of our ancestors in Africa, warriors who never bowed to any master, stories of slaves who had fought back, who had chosen death over submission. "You got that fire in you, Elijah," she had whispered to me before she died. "Don't let them put it out. Don't let them break what makes you who you are." I touched the scars on my back and made a promise to her memory. The Beaumonts thought they had broken me, thought they had turned me into just another piece of property, but they had created something else entirely. They had forged a weapon in the fires of their cruelty, and now that weapon was free. Over the following weeks, I learned to survive in ways that would have terrified the boy I used to be. I caught snakes with my bare hands, learned which berries would nourish and which would kill, and discovered that the swamp was full of other runaways, men and women who had chosen the uncertain freedom of the wilderness over the guaranteed hell of continued slavery. They called our hidden community the Ghost Camp, and I quickly became its youngest member. There was Moses, a giant of a man who had escaped from a sugar plantation upriver. There was Rebecca, a house servant who had fled after her master's son tried to force himself on her. And there was old Tom, who had been running for so long that he couldn't remember his real name or where he had come from. From them I learned that the Beaumonts weren't the only plantation family still operating, as if the war had never ended. Throughout Louisiana, powerful white families were using intimidation, violence, and legal loopholes to keep their former slaves in bondage. The federal troops were spread too thin to enforce the new laws, and local sheriffs were often in the pockets of the plantation owners. "They think they can keep us down forever," Moses said one night as we sat around our hidden fire, "but they don't understand what they've created. Every beating, every humiliation, every family they tore apart, it's all building up like pressure in a steam engine, and when it finally explodes," he didn't need to finish the sentence. We all knew what he meant. As the months passed, word of our ghost camp spread through the underground network of former slaves. People would arrive in the dead of night, carrying stories of continued abuse and desperate pleas for help. And slowly, a plan began to form in my mind. A plan that would make the Beaumont family pay for every scar on my back, every tear my mother had shed, every prayer my grandmother had whispered into the darkness. The boy who had escaped that plantation was gone forever. In his place stood someone harder, someone who understood that justice wasn't something you asked for, it was something you took, and I was going to take everything the Beaumonts owed me, with interest. They had created their own worst nightmare, and his name was Elijah Carver. The rumors started 3 months after my escape, spreading through the slave quarters like wildfire in dry grass. They said I had been seen near the old tobacco barns at midnight. They said I could move through the swamp like a ghost, appearing and disappearing without a trace. They said I was coming back for the others. They were right. I had spent those months learning everything I could about the Beaumont operation from the other runaways in Ghost Camp. The family wasn't just continuing to hold former slaves illegally. They were expanding their operation, using debt peonage and sharecropping contracts, written in language that barely literate people couldn't understand. They would advance supplies and housing to former slaves, then charge such high interest that the debt could never be repaid. It was slavery with a different name, and it was perfectly legal under Louisiana law. But what made my blood boil was learning about the children. Sarah, the little girl I had left behind, was now working 16-hour days in the cotton fields. Her fingers were bleeding from picking cotton, and she had grown thin as a rail. There were others too, boys and girls, who should have been learning to read and write, instead breaking their backs to make the Beaumonts richer. "You can't go back there, boy," old Tom warned me when I announced my intentions. "They'll be watching for you. Charles Beaumont has put a bounty on your head. $50 for you alive, 25 dead. That's more money than most folks around here see in a year." But I wasn't the same terrified child who had fled into the swamp. I had grown taller, stronger, and infinitely more dangerous. Moses had taught me how to move silently through any terrain. Rebecca had shown me how to read people's faces, how to tell when someone was lying or afraid. And the swamp itself had taught me patience, the kind of patience that lets a predator wait for exactly the right moment to strike. My first target wasn't the Beaumont family directly. It was their overseer, a vicious man named Jake Morrison, who took pleasure in using his whip on anyone who moved too slowly or looked at him wrong. Morrison lived alone in a cabin on the edge of the plantation, and he had a weakness for corn whiskey that made him predictable. I watched him for a week, learning his routines. Every night he would drink himself into a stupor, then stumble to his cabin and pass out until dawn. On Thursday nights, he would ride into town to visit a woman who worked at the saloon, leaving his cabin unguarded for hours. That's when I struck. I slipped into his cabin like smoke, moving through the darkness with the confidence of someone who had learned to see in the dark. Morrison kept records of every punishment he had administered, every slave he had beaten, every child he had terrorized. But more importantly, He kept correspondence with other overseers throughout the region, letters that detailed the illegal practices being used to keep former slaves in bondage. I took everything. Every letter, every record, every piece of evidence that could expose what the Beaumonts were really doing. But I left something behind too, a message carved into Morrison's wooden table with my knife. The ghost is watching, EC. When Morrison discovered the break-in the next morning, his screams could be heard across the plantation. He knew exactly who had been there, and the fear in his voice when he reported to Master Charles was music to my ears. I was hidden in the cypress trees near the main house, close enough to hear every word. "He was in my cabin, Mr. Beaumont," Morrison stammered. "Took all the papers, all the correspondence. He knows everything." "Impossible," Charles Beaumont snarled. "That boy is dead, probably got eaten by gators months ago." "Then explain this," Morrison said, and I could see him showing the carved message to his master. The silence that followed was delicious. I could practically taste Charles Beaumont's fear from my hiding spot. He was beginning to understand that the boy he had tortured and brutalized had grown into something far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. But my real target that night wasn't the overseer's cabin. It was the slave quarters where my people were still living in fear and desperation. I waited until the plantation was asleep, then made my way to the familiar wooden buildings where I had spent the first 15 years of my life. Sarah was in the same corner where I had left her, but she was no longer the chubby-cheeked little girl I remembered. Her arms were stick-thin, her eyes hollow with exhaustion. When she saw me emerge from the shadows, she nearly cried out in shock. "Elijah," she whispered, "is that really you?" I put my finger to my lips and knelt beside her. "I told you I'd come back for you." The other slaves began to wake up, and soon I was surrounded by familiar faces, people who had known me since birth, who had watched me grow up under the Beaumonts' cruelty. But they looked at me differently now. There was fear in their eyes, but also something else. Hope. "You can't be here," whispered Martha, an older woman who had helped raise me after my mother died. "They got dogs. They got guns. They'll kill you if they catch you." "Let them try," I said quietly. "But I'm not here to get caught. I'm here to offer you a choice." I told them about Ghost Camp, about the community of free people living in the swamp. I told them about the underground railroad routes that could take them north to places where the federal government was actually enforcing the emancipation laws, and I told them about the evidence I had gathered, evidence that could bring down the Beaumont operation once and for all. "But we can't just leave," said Samuel, a man who had worked the fields for 30 years. "They'll come after us, they'll hunt us down like animals." "They're already treating you like animals," I replied. "The only difference is that now you have a choice to fight back." I spent 2 hours in those quarters, talking to people who had given up hope years ago. Some were too afraid to leave, too broken by decades of abuse to believe that freedom was possible. But others, especially the younger ones, listened with growing excitement as I described life beyond the plantation. Before I left, I made sure to visit every building, every corner where my people were suffering. I memorized faces, counted heads, and made mental notes of who was sick, who was injured, who needed immediate help. This wasn't just a rescue mission, it was reconnaissance for something much larger. As dawn approached, I prepared to fade back into the swamp. But before I left, I had one more message to deliver. I made my way to the main house where the Beaumont family slept in comfort, built on the backs of stolen labor. The house was a monument to their wealth and power. White columns, wraparound porches, and windows that gleamed like eyes in the moonlight. I had cleaned those windows as a child, scrubbed those floors on my hands and knees, and been beaten in the basement for the smallest infractions. I climbed to the second floor, moving like a shadow through the hallways I knew by heart. Charles Beaumont's bedroom door was slightly ajar, and I could hear him snoring inside. It would have been easy to end it all right there, one quick movement, and the man who had caused so much suffering would never hurt anyone again. But that would have been too simple, too quick. Charles Beaumont deserved to suffer the way he had made others suffer. He deserved to lose everything slowly, piece by piece, until he understood what it felt like to be powerless. Instead, I left another message. This time, I carved it into the wooden frame of his bedroom door, right where he would see it when he woke up. "Your sins have found you. The reckoning begins now, EC." By the time the sun rose, I was miles away, hidden deep in the swamp where no tracker could follow. But my work was just beginning. I had seen the fear in Morrison's eyes, heard the uncertainty in Charles Beaumont's voice. They were starting to understand that their former victim had become their worst nightmare. Over the following weeks, more slaves began to disappear from the plantation. They would vanish in the night, leaving behind empty beds and unanswered questions. Some made it to Ghost Camp, where we welcomed them with open arms. Others took the underground railroad routes I had mapped out, heading north to freedom. But the most important thing was the fear that was spreading through the white community. The Beaumonts had built their power on the assumption that their victims would never fight back, never organize, never become a threat. Now they were learning how wrong they had been. The boy they had tried to break was becoming a legend, and legends, I was discovering, had power that even the wealthiest plantation owners couldn't control. The documents I had stolen from Morrison's cabin were more damning than I had ever imagined. Hidden in my makeshift shelter deep in the swamp, I spent days reading through correspondence that revealed a network of corruption stretching across 3 parishes. But it was a leather-bound ledger, tucked away in Morrison's personal effects, that made my blood run cold. The ledger contained 3 generations of Beaumont family records, dating back to 1823, when Charles's grandfather, Henri Beaumont, had first established the plantation. Page after page detailed not just the buying and selling of human beings, but something far worse: systematic breeding programs, medical experiments, and punishments that went far beyond anything I had experienced. My hands shook as I read about my own grandmother, listed not by name, but by a number. Breeding female number 47. The entries described her like livestock, noting her strong constitution and high fertility rate. They had forced her to bear 7 children, selling 6 of them to other plantations before they were old enough to remember their mother's face. But the most horrifying discovery was a section titled Disciplinary Innovations. Henri Beaumont had kept detailed records of torture methods he had developed, complete with sketches and notes on their effectiveness. He had passed these techniques down to his son, Robert, who had refined them further. And Robert had taught them to Charles, who had used them on me and countless others. The Beaumonts hadn't just owned slaves. They had turned cruelty into a science, passing down their methods like family recipes. Each generation had built upon the last, creating new ways to break the human spirit while maximizing productivity. They had documented everything with the cold precision of men who saw torture as just another business expense. I found records of children as young as 5 being separated from their mothers and sold to distant plantations. I found descriptions of pregnant women being forced to work until the moment they gave birth, then returning to the fields within days. I found accounts of slaves being used as test subjects for experimental medical procedures, their bodies treated as disposable resources for advancing white doctors' knowledge. One entry, written in Charles's father's careful handwriting, described an incident from 1851. Slave Roger of 73 attempted escape. Applied new restraint method. Iron collar with inward-facing spikes. Subject survived 14 days before expiring. Method effective for deterring future escape attempts. Recommend wider implementation. Slave number 73 had been my uncle Marcus. I remembered him vaguely from my early childhood. A tall man with kind eyes who used to carve small animals out of wood for the children. The iron collar had left him unable to lie down or turn his head, slowly driving him mad with pain and exhaustion, until his heart finally gave out. As I read deeper into the records, I began to understand the true scope of the Beaumont legacy. This wasn't just about one family's cruelty. It was about a systematic approach to dehumanization that had been refined over decades. They had kept meticulous records because they were proud of their innovations, because they saw themselves as pioneers in the science of human subjugation. But the ledger also contained something else. Detailed financial records that showed exactly how the Beaumont wealth had been built. Every dollar could be traced back to stolen labor. Every luxury in their mansion had been paid for with blood and suffering. And more importantly, the records showed that their illegal activities hadn't ended with emancipation. They had simply evolved. The current generation, led by Charles and his younger brother William, had developed new schemes to maintain their control. They were using fraudulent contracts to trap former slaves in debt peonage. They were bribing local officials to look the other way when federal laws were violated. They were even selling false freedom papers to runaway slaves, then having them arrested as fugitives when they tried to use them. But what made me truly dangerous was discovering that the Beaumonts weren't working alone. The ledger contained correspondence with other plantation families throughout Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. They were part of a network of former slaveholders who were coordinating their efforts to undermine Reconstruction and maintain white supremacy through violence and intimidation. I spent 3 days copying the most damning entries into a separate notebook, using charcoal and bark paper I had made myself. The original ledger was too valuable to risk losing, but I needed copies I could use as evidence when the time came. Every name, every date, every horrific detail, I documented it all with the same meticulous care the Beaumonts had used to record their crimes. The more I learned about the family's history, the more I understood that my escape had been just the beginning. The Beaumonts represented something larger than individual cruelty. They were the embodiment of a system that had treated human beings as property for generations. And that system was still operating, still destroying lives, still crushing the spirits of people who deserved freedom and dignity. But I also discovered something that gave me hope. Hidden among the business correspondence were letters from other former slaves who had escaped and were now working to expose the illegal activities of their former masters. There was a network of resistance growing throughout the South, made up of people who had survived the worst humanity had to offer and were now fighting back. One letter, dated just 2 months earlier, came from a woman named Harriet, who had escaped from a plantation in Mississippi. She had gathered evidence of continued slavery and was working with federal investigators to build cases against plantation owners. She mentioned a contact in New Orleans, a Union Army officer named Captain James Mitchell, who was specifically tasked with investigating violations of the Emancipation Proclamation. This was the break I had been looking for. The evidence I had gathered was damning, but I needed someone with authority to act on it. Captain Mitchell could be the key to bringing down not just the Beaumonts, but the entire network of families who were still operating as if the war had never ended. But first, I had to get the evidence to him safely. The Beaumonts had increased their patrols after my recent visits to the plantation, and they had hired additional men to hunt for me in the swamp. Morrison had been replaced by an even more vicious overseer named Cole Brennan, a man who had earned his reputation hunting runaway slaves before the war. Brennan was different from Morrison. Where Morrison had been a drunk and a bully, Brennan was a professional. He knew the swamps almost as well as I did, and he had brought tracking dogs that were trained specifically to hunt human prey. He was methodical, patient, and absolutely ruthless. I had watched him from a distance as he organized search parties, and I could see that he understood he wasn't hunting a frightened child anymore. He was hunting someone who had learned to fight back, someone who knew the terrain and had allies throughout the region. He was treating me like a military target, and that meant I had to start thinking like a soldier. The war between me and the Beaumont family was escalating, and I knew that the next phase would be far more dangerous than anything I had faced so far. But I also knew that I had advantages they couldn't understand. I had the moral authority of someone fighting for justice. I had the support of people who had suffered under their cruelty. And most importantly, I had evidence that could destroy them completely. As I prepared to make contact with Captain Mitchell, I thought about my grandmother's words, "You got that fire in you, Elijah. Don't let them put it out." The fire was still burning, but it had evolved into something the Beaumonts had never expected. It had become a flame of justice that would consume everything they had built on the backs of stolen lives. The boy they had tried to break was about to become their judge, jury, and executioner, and the evidence I carried would be the weapon that brought down 3 generations of carefully constructed evil. The reckoning was coming, and this time, there would be no escape for the Beaumont family. Cole Brennan arrived at Beaumont Plantation on a Tuesday morning, bringing with him 6 men and a pack of bloodhounds that had been trained to hunt human beings. I watched from my hiding place in the cypress trees as he surveyed the property with the cold efficiency of a military commander. This wasn't going to be like the bumbling searches Morrison had organized. Brennan was a professional manhunter, and he had come to finish what the Beaumonts had started. "Your boy has been playing games," I heard him tell Charles Beaumont as they stood on the plantation house porch. "But games end when the professionals arrive. I've tracked down over 40 runaways in the past 5 years, and I've never failed to bring one back. Dead or alive, your ghost is going to be in chains by the end of the week. Charles Beaumont nodded eagerly, his face flushed with anticipation. I want him alive, Brennan. I want him to suffer for what he's done. I want every slave in Louisiana to see what happens when they get ideas above their station. Suffering can be arranged, Brennan replied with a smile that made my skin crawl. But first we have to catch him, and that means thinking like he thinks, moving like he moves. This boy has been living in the swamp for months. He knows every path, every hiding place, every way in and out. But he's also gotten comfortable, maybe even careless. That's when we strike. I had been watching the plantation for 3 days, waiting for the right moment to make contact with the remaining slaves and gather more intelligence about the Beaumont operation. But Brennan's arrival changed everything. I could see that he was already studying the terrain, mapping out search patterns, and positioning his men to cut off escape routes I had been using for months. The dogs were the biggest threat. These weren't ordinary hunting hounds. They were massive, scarred beasts that had been trained to track and attack human prey. Brennan kept them on short leashes, but I could see the hunger in their eyes. They had been bred for one purpose, to hunt down runaway slaves and tear them apart if necessary. But I had learned a few things about survival that Brennan didn't expect. The swamp had taught me patience, but it had also taught me how to use the environment as a weapon. Every alligator, every patch of quicksand, every poisonous snake was a potential ally in the war I was fighting. My first move was to eliminate Brennan's advantage in numbers. 6 men might seem overwhelming, but they were strangers to this terrain. They didn't know which logs would support their weight, which waters were safe to cross, or which paths led to dead ends. I had grown up in these swamps, and I knew every secret they held. I started by laying false trails. Using techniques Moses had taught me, I created scent paths that would lead the dogs in circles, wasting time and exhausting both the animals and their handlers. I rubbed tree bark with my clothing, left footprints in strategic locations, and even used animal blood to create false scent markers that would confuse the tracking dogs. The first search party ventured into the swamp on Wednesday morning. I watched from a distance as Brennan's men struggled through the thick underbrush, their city clothes and heavy boots making them clumsy and loud. The dogs picked up one of my false trails immediately, leading the group deeper into a section of swamp where the water was waist deep and the mud would suck a man's boots clean off his feet. By noon, they were exhausted, frustrated, and completely lost. I could hear them arguing among themselves, their voices carrying across the water as they tried to figure out which direction would lead them back to solid ground. One of the men had already been bitten by a water moccasin, and another had fallen into a patch of quicksand that had taken 3 men to pull him out. But Brennan wasn't discouraged. If anything, the difficulties seemed to energize him. "The boy is playing with us," he told his men as they made camp that evening. "He's trying to wear us down, make us give up, but that just proves he's still here, still watching. Tomorrow, we change tactics." That night, I made my move. While Brennan's men slept in their makeshift camp, I crept close enough to hear their conversations and gather intelligence about their plans. But more importantly, I had an opportunity to send them a message they wouldn't forget. I slipped into their camp like a ghost, moving between the sleeping men with the silence I had learned from months of hunting in the swamp. Their supplies were stacked carelessly near the dying fire: food, ammunition, and most importantly, their maps and tracking equipment. I took what I needed and destroyed the rest. Their compass went into the deepest part of the swamp, where it would never be found. Their maps I tore into pieces and scattered to the wind. Their food supplies I contaminated with swamp water that would make them violently ill within hours. But the message I left was the most important part. Using my knife, I carved words into a tree that stood directly in the center of their camp. "You are the hunted now. Leave or join your prey in the mud. E.C." When Brennan's men woke up the next morning, the fear in their voices was unmistakable. They had come into the swamp thinking they were hunting a frightened boy, but they were beginning to understand that they were facing something far more dangerous. The predator had become the prey, and the roles had been reversed completely. "He was here," one of the men whispered, his voice shaking. "He was right here while we slept. He could have killed us all." "But he didn't," Brennan replied, though I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "He's playing psychological games, trying to break our nerve. It won't work." But it was working. Over the next 2 days, I picked off Brennan's men one by one, not killing them, but removing them from the hunt in ways that would send a clear message to anyone else who might consider coming after me. The first man I caught alone was named Peters, a thin, nervous tracker who had been bragging about all the runaways he had captured. I waited until he separated from the group to relieve himself, then struck from behind with a blow that knocked him unconscious. When he woke up, he was tied to a tree deep in the swamp, surrounded by alligators and with a note pinned to his chest. "Tell your friends that mercy has limits." The second man, a burly enforcer named Jackson, I led into a section of swamp where the ground was unstable. A carefully placed rope trap sent him tumbling into a pit I had dug and camouflaged weeks earlier. He wasn't seriously injured, but he was trapped until his companions found him hours later, covered in mud and humiliated beyond measure. By Friday, Brennan was down to 3 men, and the remaining hunters were jumping at shadows. They had come into the swamp with confidence and superior numbers, but they were leaving with their tails between their legs and stories that would spread throughout the region. But the most important victory wasn't the fear I had instilled in Brennan's men. It was the intelligence I had gathered about the Beaumont operation. While they were stumbling around the swamp looking for me, I had been watching the plantation, documenting their illegal activities, and making contact with slaves who were ready to testify against their former masters. I had also made contact with Captain Mitchell through an intermediary, a free black man named Samuel, who worked as a blacksmith in New Orleans and had connections with federal investigators. The evidence I had gathered was now in the hands of someone who could act on it, and the wheels of justice were finally beginning to turn. The hunt that was supposed to end with my capture had become something entirely different. It had become a demonstration of power, proof that the Beaumont family was no longer untouchable, that their reign of terror was coming to an end. As Brennan and his remaining men retreated from the swamp, I knew that the next phase of my war against the Beaumonts would be even more dangerous. They would bring more men, better equipment, and deadlier tactics, but they would also be facing an enemy who had learned to use their own methods against them. The boy they had tried to break had become a force of nature, and nature, I had learned, always finds a way to reclaim what has been stolen from it. The letter from Captain Mitchell arrived through Samuel the blacksmith on a rain-soaked Monday morning. Hidden in a hollowed-out piece of iron that looked like scrap metal, the message was brief but electrifying. Evidence received, investigation authorized, need witnesses, federal protection available, time to act. I had been waiting for this moment for months, but now that it was here, the weight of responsibility felt crushing. The evidence I had gathered could destroy the Beaumont family and their network of collaborators, but only if I could convince other survivors to come forward and testify, and that meant asking people who had already suffered unimaginable trauma to relive their worst memories in front of white officials who might not believe them. The first person I approached was Martha, the woman who had helped raise me after my mother died. I found her working in the plantation kitchen, her hands scarred from years of burns and cuts, her back bent from decades of labor. When she saw me emerge from the shadows of the storage room, her face went white with terror. "Elijah, you can't be here," she whispered, glancing nervously toward the main house. "They got new men watching everything. They'll kill you if they catch you." "I'm not here to hide anymore, Martha," I said quietly. "I'm here to end this, all of it, but I need your help." I told her about Captain Mitchell, about the federal investigation, about the possibility of finally bringing the Beaumonts to justice. But I could see the fear in her eyes, the same fear that had kept our people silent for generations. "You don't understand," she said, her voice barely audible. "They got ways of making people disappear. They got judges in their pocket, sheriffs who do their bidding. Even if we testify, even if they get arrested, they'll find a way to make us pay." "Not this time," I insisted. "This is different. The federal government is involved now. They have the power to protect witnesses, to make sure justice is served." But Martha wasn't convinced, and I couldn't blame her. She had lived through decades of broken promises, false hopes, and brutal retaliation against anyone who dared to speak out. The idea that white officials would actually listen to black testimony, much less act on it, seemed impossible to her. It took me 3 visits over the course of a week to finally convince her to meet with Captain Mitchell. And even then, she only agreed because I promised to be there with her, to make sure she wasn't walking into a trap. The meeting was arranged for the following Sunday at an abandoned church deep in the swamp, a place where runaway slaves had once gathered to worship in secret. Captain Mitchell arrived with 2 other federal officers, all of them armed, but trying to appear non-threatening. He was younger than I had expected, maybe 30 years old, with the kind of earnest face that suggested he actually believed in the cause he was fighting for. "Mrs. Martha," he said, removing his hat as she approached, "thank you for agreeing to speak with us. I know this takes tremendous courage." Martha looked at me uncertainly, then back at the captain. "Elijah says you can protect us, says you can make them pay for what they've done." "That's exactly what we intend to do," Mitchell replied, "but we need your testimony to make it happen. We need you to tell us what you've seen, what you've experienced. Every detail matters." What followed was the most difficult conversation I had ever witnessed. Martha, speaking in a voice that shook with emotion, described decades of abuse that went far beyond anything I had experienced. She told them about children being sold away from their mothers, about women being raped by their masters, about men being worked to death in the fields. She described punishments that were designed not just to inflict pain, but to break the human spirit completely. But the most damning testimony came when she described the current situation, the illegal contracts, the debt peonage, the continued use of violence to keep former slaves in line. She had witnessed Charles Beaumont personally beating a man who had tried to leave the plantation, and she had seen the forged documents that were being used to trap people in permanent servitude. "They think the war didn't change nothing," she said, tears streaming down her face. "They think they can keep treating us like animals, like we ain't human beings with rights and feelings. But we are human. We got souls, we got families, we got dreams just like anybody else." Captain Mitchell took careful notes throughout her testimony, asking clarifying questions and requesting specific dates and names whenever possible. I could see that he was genuinely moved by what he was hearing, but more importantly, I could see that he believed her. This wasn't just another bureaucrat going through the motions. This was someone who understood the gravity of what we were revealing. Over the following weeks, I brought more witnesses to meet with Captain Mitchell. There was Samuel, who had been forced to work in the sugar mill despite losing 2 fingers in an accident. There was Rebecca, who had been sexually assaulted by William Beaumont and then beaten when she tried to report it. There was old Tom, who had witnessed the murder of a slave who had tried to escape in 1863, 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation had supposedly freed him. Each testimony added another layer to the case against the Beaumont family. But more importantly, each witness who came forward inspired others to find their courage. Word spread through the underground network of former slaves that someone was finally listening, that there might actually be consequences for the people who had caused so much suffering. The breakthrough came when we made contact with James, a former house servant who had worked directly for the Beaumont family for over 20 years. He had been present during family meetings where illegal activities were planned, and he had overheard conversations that directly implicated Charles and William Beaumont in ongoing crimes. "They never thought I was listening," James told Captain Mitchell during his testimony. "To them I was just furniture, just another piece of property that happened to have ears. But I heard everything. I know about the bribes they paid to local officials. I know about the contracts they forged. I know about the people they had killed to keep them quiet." James's testimony was the final piece of evidence Captain Mitchell needed to move forward with arrests. But he also brought disturbing news about the scope of the conspiracy we were fighting. "This isn't just about the Beaumonts," he told me after James's testimony. "They're part of a network that stretches across the entire South. Former Confederate officers, plantation owners, local politicians, they're all working together to undermine Reconstruction and maintain white supremacy through violence and intimidation." "How many families are involved?" I asked. "Dozens, maybe hundreds. The Beaumonts are just one piece of a much larger puzzle, but they're also one of the most visible pieces. And if we can bring them down, it will send a message to the others that the federal government is serious about enforcing the law." As we prepared for the arrests, I felt a mixture of anticipation and dread. The Beaumont family had seemed untouchable for so long that it was hard to believe they could actually be held accountable for their crimes. But I also knew that they wouldn't go down without a fight, and that fight could put everyone who had testified against them in serious danger. The night before the arrests were scheduled to take place, I made one final visit to the plantation. Not to gather evidence or rescue anyone, but to say goodbye to the place that had shaped me into who I had become. The slave quarters where I had grown up, the fields where my people had suffered, the main house where the Beaumont family had planned their cruelties. All of it would soon be part of a federal investigation that would expose their crimes to the world. As I stood in the shadows of the cypress trees, looking at the plantation that had been my prison for the first 15 years of my life, I thought about all the people who had died without ever seeing justice. My mother, my grandmother, my Uncle Marcus. They had all suffered and died believing that their oppressors would never be held accountable. But tomorrow, that would change. Tomorrow, the voices of the dead would finally be heard, and the living would see that justice, however delayed, was still possible. The boy who had escaped into the swamp was about to become the man who brought down an empire built on human suffering. And the reckoning that had been generations in the making was finally at hand. The federal agents arrived at dawn on a Tuesday morning, their blue uniforms cutting through the Louisiana mist like harbingers of justice. I watched from my hiding place in the cypress trees as Captain Mitchell led a force of 20 soldiers toward the Beaumont plantation house, their rifles gleaming in the early sunlight. After months of planning and gathering evidence, the moment of reckoning had finally arrived. Charles Beaumont was eating breakfast on his veranda when the soldiers surrounded the house. I could see his face clearly through my spyglass, the same arrogant expression he had worn when he beat me as a child, the same cold eyes that had looked at human beings as property. But as Captain Mitchell approached with an arrest warrant in his hand, that arrogance began to crack. "Charles Beaumont," Mitchell announced in a voice that carried across the plantation grounds, "you are under arrest for violations of the 13th and 14th Amendments to the Constitution, conspiracy to commit kidnapping, fraud, and the illegal detention of United States citizens." The color drained from Beaumont's face as the charges were read. He had built his entire life on the assumption that he was above the law, that his wealth and connections would protect him from any consequences. Now he was learning that the federal government had power that even his money couldn't buy. "This is outrageous," he sputtered, rising from his chair. "I am a respected member of this community. I have rights. You can't just—" "You have the right to remain silent," Mitchell interrupted. "I suggest you use it." As the soldiers placed Charles Beaumont in shackles, I felt a surge of emotion that I hadn't expected. This was the man who had scarred my back, who had sold my friends, who had treated me like an animal for the first 15 years of my life. Seeing him in chains, seeing the fear in his eyes, should have felt like pure triumph. Instead, I felt something more complex, a mixture of satisfaction and sadness, justice and emptiness. The arrest of William Beaumont was even more dramatic. Charles's younger brother had always been the more violent of the two, the one who took personal pleasure in inflicting pain. When the soldiers came for him, he was in the stables, beating a young boy who had supposedly let one of the horses get loose. "Step away from the child," Captain Mitchell ordered, his hand on his pistol. William Beaumont turned with a snarl, his whip still raised. "This is my property and that's my slave. You have no authority here." "That child is a free citizen of the United States," Mitchell replied, "and you are under arrest for assault, illegal detention, and conspiracy to violate federal law." William made the mistake of trying to use his whip on the federal officer. Mitchell drew his pistol and fired a warning shot into the air, and suddenly William found himself surrounded by 20 rifles pointed directly at his chest. The whip fell from his hand as he realized that his reign of terror was over. But the most satisfying arrest was that of Cole Brennan, the professional manhunter, who had been brought in to capture me. He was found hiding in the overseer's cabin, apparently having decided that discretion was the better part of valor when federal troops arrived. The man who had boasted about never failing to bring back a runaway was now cowering under a bed like a frightened child. "Cole Brennan," Mitchell announced as the soldiers dragged him out, "you are under arrest for conspiracy, assault with intent to commit bodily harm, and violation of federal civil rights laws." As the three main conspirators were loaded into a prison wagon, I made my way to the slave quarters to witness the moment I had been dreaming of for months. The federal soldiers were going from building to building, informing the residents that they were free to leave, that their illegal contracts were void, and that anyone who tried to stop them would be arrested. The reaction was everything I had hoped for, and more. People who had lived in fear for their entire lives were suddenly laughing, crying, embracing each other with joy. Children who had never known anything but bondage were learning that they could go to school, that they could choose their own names, that they could dream of futures beyond the plantation. Martha was standing in the doorway of the kitchen, tears streaming down her face as she watched the Beaumont brothers being taken away in chains. When she saw me approaching, she ran toward me with her arms outstretched. "Elijah," she sobbed, "you did it. You actually did it. They're gone." "They can't hurt us anymore." I held her as she cried, feeling the weight of responsibility that had driven me for so many months finally beginning to lift. But even in that moment of triumph, I knew that this was just the beginning. The Beaumont family was finished, but the system they represented was still intact. There were dozens of other plantation families throughout the South who were still operating illegal slavery operations, still treating human beings as property. Captain Mitchell approached us as the prison wagon disappeared down the plantation road. "Mr. Carver," he said, extending his hand, "I want to thank you for your courage in bringing this case to our attention. Without your evidence and your willingness to organize witnesses, none of this would have been possible." "What happens now?" I asked. "Will they actually be convicted? Will they serve time for what they've done?" "The evidence is overwhelming," Mitchell replied. "Between the documents you recovered and the testimony of the witnesses, we have enough to convict them on multiple federal charges. They're looking at decades in prison, and their assets will be seized to provide compensation to their victims." But Mitchell also had sobering news about the broader fight we were engaged in. The Beaumont case is just one of many we're investigating throughout the region. The resistance to reconstruction is more organized than we initially realized. Former Confederate officers are coordinating efforts to undermine federal authority, and they're using violence and intimidation to maintain white supremacy. "How many other families are involved?" I asked. "We've identified at least 40 plantation families in Louisiana alone who are operating similar schemes. And that's just what we know about. The network extends into Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, throughout the former Confederacy." As we talked, I could see other federal agents searching the plantation house, documenting evidence and seizing records that would be used in future prosecutions. The Beaumont family's carefully maintained facade of respectability was being stripped away, revealing the ugly truth that had always lurked beneath the surface. But the most important moment came when Captain Mitchell gathered all the former slaves together to explain their rights and options. Some chose to leave immediately, heading north to cities where they could start new lives. Others decided to stay and work the land as free laborers, finally able to negotiate fair wages and working conditions. A few, including Martha, chose to come with me to help identify other illegal operations throughout the region. As the sun set on that historic day, I stood on the porch of the plantation house, where I had once been beaten and humiliated. The Beaumont family portraits had been taken down, their furniture was being inventoried for seizure, and their reign of terror was officially over. But I also knew that my work was far from finished. The boy who had escaped into the swamp had become a man with a mission: to expose every illegal slavery operation in the South, to bring justice to every family that had profited from human suffering, and to ensure that the promises of emancipation were finally fulfilled. The Beaumont plantation was silent for the first time in decades, its fields empty of forced labor, its quarters no longer echoing with the sounds of suffering. But across the South, there were still people living in bondage, still families profiting from stolen labor, still children growing up without hope of freedom. The reckoning had begun, but it was far from over, and I intended to see it through to the end, no matter how long it took or how dangerous it became. The most feared slave boy who ever lived had become something even more powerful, a force for justice that would not rest until every chain was broken and every wrong was made right. 5 years have passed since the Beaumont plantation fell silent, and I am writing these words from a small office in Washington, D.C., where I now work with the Freedmen's Bureau to investigate illegal slavery operations throughout the South. The boy who once hid in the Louisiana swamps has become a man whose testimony has helped convict over 200 former slaveholders and their collaborators. The Beaumont case became a landmark in federal prosecution of post-war slavery crimes. Charles Beaumont died in federal prison after serving only 2 years of his 20-year sentence. Some said it was his heart, others whispered it was poison administered by fellow inmates who had their own scores to settle. William Beaumont is still serving his sentence, though reports from the prison suggest that his mind has broken under the weight of his crimes. Cole Brennan was released after 5 years, but disappeared shortly afterward. Some say he fled to Mexico, others believe he met a more permanent fate at the hands of his former victims. But the real victory wasn't in the punishment of individual criminals, it was in the systematic dismantling of the network they represented. The evidence we gathered from the Beaumont plantation led to investigations across 7 states, resulting in the liberation of over 3,000 people who were being held in illegal bondage. Entire families were reunited, children who had been sold away from their parents were returned, and communities that had been scattered by slavery were able to rebuild. The plantation itself was seized by the federal government and divided among the former slaves who had worked the land. Martha now owns the plot where she once labored as property, and she has turned it into a school for freed children. The main house where the Beaumont family once planned their cruelties has been converted into a community center where former slaves can learn to read and write, receive medical care, and access legal services. But perhaps the most important change has been in the stories that are told about resistance and justice. Throughout the South, people speak in whispers about the boy who escaped into the swamp and brought down one of the most powerful plantation families in Louisiana. Some of the details have been embellished over time. They say I could disappear into thin air, that I could speak to the animals of the swamp, that I was protected by the spirits of all the slaves who had died seeking freedom. I don't mind the embellishments. Legends have power that facts sometimes lack, and if the story of Elijah Carver can inspire other people to fight back against injustice, then I'm proud to be part of that mythology. Children who have never known slavery learn about the boy who refused to accept his chains, and they grow up believing that resistance is possible, that justice can prevail, that even the most powerful oppressors can be brought down by courage and determination. The work continues, though it has evolved as the South has changed. The crude illegal slavery operations of the immediate post-war period have largely been eliminated, but they have been replaced by more sophisticated forms of oppression, sharecropping systems designed to trap families in permanent debt, legal codes that criminalize normal behavior when practiced by black citizens, and vigilante groups that use terror to maintain white supremacy. Each new challenge requires new strategies, new alliances, and new forms of resistance. I have learned to work within the legal system, using federal courts and constitutional amendments to fight battles that once could only be won with violence. But I have also learned that the law is only as strong as the people who are willing to enforce it, and that justice requires constant vigilance from those who have the most to lose. The scars on my back have faded over the years, but they serve as a permanent reminder of where I came from and why the work matters. Every morning when I dress for another day of investigations and testimony, I run my fingers over those raised lines and remember the boy who once thought that suffering was his permanent fate. That boy could never have imagined that he would one day sit in federal courtrooms, cross-examining former plantation owners and helping to write the laws that would protect future generations from the horrors he had experienced. The most rewarding part of my work now is mentoring other young people who have survived trauma and want to fight for justice. They come to my office with stories that echo my own, tales of abuse, exploitation, and systematic dehumanization. But they also come with something that I recognize from my own journey, an unbreakable determination to ensure that others don't suffer as they have suffered. Last month, I received a letter from a young woman named Sarah, the same Sarah I had left behind in the slave quarters all those years ago. She is now 21 years old, married to a man who treats her with respect and love, and the mother of 2 children who will grow up free. She has learned to read and write, and she is teaching other former slaves in her community. Her letter was simple but profound. Thank you for coming back for us, Elijah. Thank you for showing us that we were worth saving. That letter sits framed on my desk next to a photograph of the old Beaumont plantation as it looks today. Fields full of crops grown by free laborers, children playing where once there were only chains, and the main house transformed into a symbol of hope rather than oppression. It reminds me every day that individual acts of courage can create ripples that spread far beyond what we can imagine, but I also keep reminders of the work that still needs to be done. Reports cross my desk daily about lynchings in Mississippi, about black families being driven from their land in Alabama, about children being denied education in Georgia. The legal framework for equality exists now, but the cultural and economic systems that supported slavery have proven remarkably adaptable. They evolve, they find new forms, they persist in ways that require constant vigilance and resistance. The boy they once called the most feared who ever lived has become a man whose greatest fear is that future generations will forget the lessons of our struggle, that they will take their freedom for granted, that they will believe that justice is automatic rather than something that must be fought for and defended every single day. That's why I'm writing this account, not to glorify violence or revenge, but to document the truth about what resistance looks like when people have no other options. The Beaumont family represented a system that treated human beings as property, that built wealth on stolen labor, that used violence and terror to maintain power. That system didn't end because of good intentions or gradual reform. It ended because people like me, like Martha, like all the witnesses who found the courage to testify, decided that enough was enough. The legend of Elijah Carver has taken on a life of its own throughout the South. Parents tell their children about the boy who escaped into the swamp and brought down his oppressors. Former slaves name their sons after me, hoping they will inherit the courage to fight injustice wherever they find it. And sometimes late at night, I receive visits from young people who are facing their own impossible situations, looking for guidance about how to resist, how to survive, how to transform their pain into power. To them, I always say the same thing my grandmother said to me: "You got that fire in you, don't let them put it out. Don't let them break what makes you who you are." The fire that began in a slave quarter in Louisiana has spread across the South and beyond. It burns in courtrooms where black lawyers argue for civil rights. It burns in schools where former slaves teach their children to read. It burns in churches where communities gather to plan their resistance to ongoing oppression. And it burns in the hearts of young people who refuse to accept that injustice is permanent or inevitable. The Beaumont plantation is quiet now, its fields peaceful, its quarters transformed into homes for free families. But the spirit that brought down that empire of cruelty lives on in every person who chooses resistance over submission, justice over comfort, truth over silence. They called me the most feared slave boy who ever lived, but I prefer to think of myself as something else entirely. A reminder that no system of oppression is permanent, that no injustice is too powerful to overcome, and that sometimes the most unlikely people can change the course of history. The boy who escaped into the swamp became a legend, but more importantly, he became proof that freedom is not something that can be given or taken away. It is something that lives in the human spirit, waiting for the right moment to break free and transform the world. And that transformation continues, one act of courage at a time, one voice raised in defiance at a time, one person choosing justice over fear at a time. The reckoning that began with the fall of the Beaumont family will continue until every chain is broken and every wrong is made right. This is my story, but it is also the story of everyone who has ever refused to accept that suffering is their permanent fate. The legend of the feared boy lives on, not in the past, but in the future we are still fighting to create.